Hey, what's going on, BookTube? That still sounds kind of weird. This is my first book review, and I thought I would review a great book that I read while living in Japan. That's Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. And if any of you have lived in Japan or another non-English speaking country, you know sometimes it can be hard to find English language books. But Japan has no shortage of Kazuo Ishiguro books or Murakami. In English or Japanese. And I really like Kazuo Ishiguro. I've previously read The Remains of the Day. That's a Booker Prize winner. It also has a book starring Anthony Hopkins. A lot of short fiction writers might be familiar with some of his short fiction. He has a collection called Nocturnes that's pretty good. I like A Family Supper. In 2017, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And his work can get pretty emotional. And this book is no exception. This is a very emotional book. I cried a bit. As far as genre goes, this is definitely literary fiction, but it has some sci-fi elements and some romantic elements as well. I think the term dystopia light can be applied to this book. Maybe sci-fi realism is another tag I've heard associated with this book, if you're into tags. If you read a lot of sci-fi but not a lot of literary fiction, this might be a good bridge book for you. I know a lot of high schools have started assigning this book despite mild sexual elements involved. And I know since Ishiguro has won the Nobel Prize, it's probably a very safe call to do so. And as far as high schoolers liking the book, I think the writing is very accessible. But they'll probably just watch the movie, honestly. Oh yeah, and there's a movie starring Keira Knightley, Kathy Mulligan, and one of the Spider-Men. Don't watch the trailer because it will spoil the whole book for you. There's a lot of talk about spoilers with this book, and in the first part of this review, I'm not going to spoil any of the science fiction elements. I'm going to talk about a few things, but I'll talk later about some of the more detailed elements of this book. But I do have to say, if you're reading closely, you'll probably pick up on what's going on in this book rather quickly. I never thought it was a big twist or anything like that. So here's what the back of the book says. In one of the most acclaimed novels of recent years, Kazuo Ishiguro imagines the lives of a group of students growing up in a darkly skewed version of contemporary England. Narrated by Kathy, now 31, Never Let Me Go dramatizes her attempts to come to terms with her childhood at the seemingly idyllic Hailsham School, and with the fate that has always awaited her and her closest friends in the wider world. A story of love, friendship, and memory. Never Let Me Go is charged throughout with a sense of the fragility of life. And that's a pretty good summary. I would add that Kathy is the POV character. She's a carer. A carer's job is to take care of donors. And we see in the first chapter that Kathy is a very good carer, and she's had many donors in the past. And we don't know the specifics of what that means, but as we read, we kind of learn more about it. We get a lot of information early on, but nothing is explicitly stated. This story is kind of told from Kathy's memory of events, so she's not necessarily giving you a lot of exposition at one time. So the story is broken up into 3 parts. The first part, Kathy begins telling her story to one of her donors about her time at Hailsham School, kind of early childhood, early adolescence, that kind of age. The second part is when her and her friends are a little bit older and they leave Hailsham School. And then the third part is kind of when her and her friends set into their careers of carers and donors. There's 3 main characters in this book. There's Kathy, the POV character, and then her 2 friends, Ruth, the kind of bossy, sometimes demanding best friend, and Tommy, the kind of clumsy yet endearing boy character. And I guess I can talk about the first part of the book without spoiling too much. So the first part takes place in this boarding school called Hailsham. I can never say it right. Hailsham School. So the first part takes place in this boarding school called Hailsham. And on the surface, this boarding school seems pretty average as far as British boarding schools go. But there's a few odd details peppered throughout. There's an odd focus on the students' health. The students have these kind of meetings where they talk about smoking and sex at a very early age. There's also an extreme focus on the students creating and appreciating each other's artwork. A mystery begins to form when a character called the Madam starts collecting kind of the best pieces of artwork the students produce. And the instructors or guardians aren't very forthcoming with what's happening to the artwork or where's it going. There's also a guy who comes around with some like secondhand junk every once in a while, and they spend their kind of faux money on some of the junk he has. But the students really love the kind of scraps he brings because it's their connection to the outside world, and these pieces of junk become their personal treasures. And there's a believable level of brainwashing going on in this book. The students don't question a lot of these strange occurrences that are happening to them, and to Ishiguro's credit, I can believe that Kathy wouldn't question these things because she's been taught them her entire life. A great example that comes from this is the students of Hailsham are afraid of this forest around the school. There's nothing supernatural or weird about it, it's just a normal forest. The students begin to generate their own stories about this forest and myths. And it's kind of frustrating because you see the students kind of internalizing their own oppression in this bad situation. I'll talk more about this later, but we see a big change in the second part of the book where the characters struggle to live in the real world with their meager understanding of how everything works. Yeah, let's look at some of the blurbs on the back of this book. Brilliant! The most exact and affecting of his books to date. Observer. Kazuo Ishiguro is a master storyteller in a class of his own making. Independent. A wonderful novel. The best Ishiguro has written since The Remains of the Day. Washington Post. A page-turner and a heartbreaker. A tour de force of knotted tension and buried anguish. Time. A gothic tour de force and an oblique and elegiac. Oh, that's a good word. That's a good word there. Meditation on morality and lost innocence. New York Times. As you can see, a lot of buzzwords you usually see from these outlets and publications. And I think the book lives up to most of these descriptions. I had a very intense reading experience with this book. At a certain point, it becomes very hard to put down. Ishiguro puts readers in a situation where they want to pity these characters, and the characters continually find joy in this horrible situation. Kathy, the narrator, is definitely contemplative about her situation, but she rarely takes things to that bleak or nihilistic place. Often her and the other characters think back to the halcyon times. And that's what really made this book heartbreaking as a reader. Now, I don't have a lot of criticisms of this book, but there have been a few levied at it that I can definitely understand. I think the first is the pacing. Now, if you're looking for a piece of contemporary literary fiction, I think this book is paced perfectly well. It's actually kind of fast. It flows really nicely. But if you're a reader of maybe like sci-fi or YA, this book might seem a little slow to you. But there's definitely not a lot of action or anything like that. It's very down to earth. The sci-fi elements aren't very flashy or crazy. So as someone coming from reading a lot of books from those genres, I can definitely understand those criticisms. That being said, I never really had a problem with it. The prose flow very nicely. I can kind of believe that this is coming from someone's memory. There's a lot of things that are kind of questioned. Are they remembered, misremembered? How did this person remember them? As far as the prose go, it was very well done. So the ending is another point of contention for some readers. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I thought it was okay. For me, the ending wasn't the most enjoyable part of the book. For some people, I know they put a lot of weight or emphasis on the ending of a book. And I understand that. I think for some readers, they're expecting a big payoff at the end. And this book has a payoff, but it's not a big twist or anything like that. My enjoyment of the book definitely came through the characters and kind of seeing their thought processes. I think the love triangle might turn a few people off, and usually I don't like love triangles, like at all. But what this book does better than, like, let's say Twilight. Most readers probably know Twilight as the prototypical love triangle, where we have, what was her name, Bella at the top, then vampire guy, werewolf dude. My problem with that love triangle was I saw how she interacted with each guy. I didn't get a clear sense of how they interacted with each other. It was a strained relationship for understandable reasons, but that part of the triangle wasn't so connected to me. And in a lot of these love triangles, it's the main person and their relationship with these two other people. Their relationship is usually tenuous or just strained. Whereas this book, all three characters in the love triangle, they each have a relationship with each other, and they each have a complex relationship with each other, which is probably how you should do that. I think more common in books now, we see like a love tint, not a love triangle, where it's about these two characters' relationship to the main love interest. So overall, I think the story and the writing are excellent. I think it would definitely be accessible for high school readers and adults. The movie's okay, but I definitely recommend reading the book in this situation. Pick up this book. You can definitely find it at used bookstores, especially in America. Yeah, and that's the last thing before I go into the kind of spoilery discussion. Okay, so I know this isn't a major revelation in the book, but we learn early on that the students of Hailsham are clones. Clones made for the specific purpose of organ donation. After they reach a certain age, they kind of transition to being carers and eventually donors. The carer's job is to help these clones through their donation process. And I don't know if this is specifically stated in the book, but it usually takes a pretty long time for most people to go through the donation process. It's not a one-time thing. Definitely the characters in this book are alive for, it's not specifically stated, but maybe a year, maybe a few months. At the beginning of this book, Kathy states that she's tired of being a carer. And we don't know what that means when we first hear it, but as we read, it kind of means she's ready to start donating her organs, which she's been a carer for a long time. She's seen all of her friends die through this book. So it's very somber when we start to understand what that means for her. Now, I don't think knowing this spoils the book. Not at all, actually. I think hearing it and reading it are two different things, and when you read it, it continually finds ways to kind of shock you as a reader how kind of cold and heartless this system is. Also, I think most people will pick up on what's going on relatively early on. Maybe not the full picture, but you'll understand they're kind of donating their organs. First chapter, they give you enough information, but once you get a few chapters in, you're kind of like, okay, this is what's happening. But this leads into the real-world discussion of organ donations and the illegal organ trade. This dystopian world has found their solution to this complex geopolitical issue. The question boils down to the value of these clones' lives, and that's a real parallel for maybe third world or global south people in our world. This book doesn't question whether or not we should be doing this morally. It's happening. It's a reality. What the book does question is what is the most humane way to do this? Much like it is in real life, it's a reality, not something we can debate morally. And I thought it was really well done. But this kind of leads into the discussion about the ending. So this is like the real spoiler warning. A few questions arise throughout the novel. The first is, why are they making all this artwork? Where's it going? Why is the madam collecting it? Then in the second part, this rumor comes up that if two clones can prove that they're in love with each other enough, they can get kind of a reprieve from the donation system, at least for a few years. Eventually, Tommy and Kathy connect these two ideas of the artwork and this thing to get a reprieve from the organ donation. They connect them in their heads and they start piecing this story together. At the end of the book, they go to talk to the madam, and the madam's living with the headmistress, and they kind of break down what was happening the whole time. Them collecting artwork was just a way for them to make money for Hailsham School, and Hailsham School, in total, was just a humane way to treat these clones, whereas other places were doing it differently or not as humanely. And she kind of explains that Hailsham was their attempt at doing this in the best way they could. The art was merely a way to get funding. There was no deeper meaning than that. which can be a struggle for some readers because the book kind of pushes you in a few ways to look for a deeper meaning. I think a really big part of it was part of the book they start thinking about who they're based after, who are the clones modeled after. And we never find out, but in your head, I was definitely drawing conclusions about, maybe these clones are based on artists or something like that. And you start making connections and drawing conclusions much like the characters do. This didn't bother me, but there was a frustration that there's not something deeper. But again, this is kind of what the novel's about. Hard truths. We have to accept a bleak reality sometimes. I thought there was something very palpable about the way this book ended. A related criticism, and this is definitely one I was kind of thinking the whole time. Why don't these clones try to rebel or escape? So these characters kind of accept their fate with little or no question. They definitely get aspirations. Like one of the characters wants an office job. This whole reprieve from the donation system for a few years. There's definitely questions and hopes, but there's never a big rebellion or anything like that. This is very frustrating as a reader. I was definitely looking for that happy ending. That's one of the things that keeps you reading. I think a good metaphor for this is when they go to visit the ship that's run aground. So later in the book, they go to look at the ship. It's been abandoned on dry land. And it kind of becomes a metaphor for the characters. You see? Ship, dry land. The ship is obviously a metaphor for escape, adventure, but it's not in the water. It's on dry land. It has nowhere to go, no way to access these dreams or hopes they have. This is very applicable to the characters. They have these dreams, but their knowledge of the outside world is so meager, so sparse. They have no way to access these dreams. They have no way to make these dreams come true. I thought this was pretty well done. And also with the levels of indoctrination and brainwashing, I don't think they would have tried to make a rebellion or like attack a doctor or something. But yeah, Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know. I'm leaving Japan soon, so I got a bunch of these books I gotta give away. I'd like to talk about them before. Thanks for watching.